Everyone in the family knew that Sarah's husband had forbidden her to ever touch the living room floor. No one understood why, a strange request he had repeated even on his deathbed. Years later, when Sarah was left a widow with no money, she decided to break that promise. Beneath one rotten floorboard, she discovered a secret that changed everything she thought she knew about her husband and their life together. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching this video from. The sky was the color of wet ashes on the morning they buried David Harper. The fields that once shone gold in late summer lay dormant now, a stretch of brown and brittle stalks, the ground still frozen from winter's breath. A small group of mourners gathered under a sagging gray tent by the old maple tree, where the Harpers had buried 3 generations before him. The wind carried a thin drizzle across their coats, and the only sound breaking the quiet came from the steady thump of earth falling against the wooden coffin below. Sarah Harper stood motionless, her black gloves soaked through, fingers clenched around the single rose she could not bring herself to throw in. Beside her, 12-year-old Eli held her hand so tightly that her knuckles ached, though she did not pull away. He said nothing. He hadn't spoken since the night his father died. When the pastor's words faded into the hum of the rain, one by one the neighbors offered quiet condolences. "He was a good man," someone whispered. "Hard-working, the kind they don't make anymore." Sarah nodded, her lips pressed into a line. She had no words left. She only heard the hollow sound of earth, and somewhere beneath it, the echo of David's voice from that last week. Weak, raspy, but unmistakably firm. "Promise me you'll never touch the living room floor." At the time, she had smiled through tears, thinking it the delirium of a dying man. But now, as she stood over the freshly turned soil, that sentence dug itself into her memory like a splinter that refused to work its way out. The rain thickened as the mourners drifted away, their boots sinking into the mud. Eli finally loosened his grip and looked up at her. His eyes were wide but dry. "Can we go home?" he whispered, his voice hoarse from disuse. She only nodded. There was nothing more to say. The drive back to the farmhouse was short, but it felt endless. The road cut through bare trees and the vast emptiness of the fields. Every fence post, every rusted mailbox seemed to stare back at her with accusation. When the house finally appeared, a hunched silhouette against the dull sky, her chest tightened. It had once been full of life. The clatter of dishes, David's laughter echoing through the kitchen, the smell of bread, baking. Now it stood silent. A shell. Inside, the air was thick and stale. Her boots left dark prints on the worn floorboards as she crossed the threshold. The house greeted her with its familiar chorus of creaks and sighs. She hung her coat by the door and froze. On the peg beside hers still hung David's old flannel jacket, the sleeves stiff with dust. His work boots sat neatly under the bench, a pair of ghosts she couldn't bear to move. Eli brushed past her and went straight to his room, closing the door softly. The sound of that door closing broke something in her. She wandered into the kitchen where the yellowed wallpaper peeled away in curling strips. The sink was piled with dishes from before the hospital. She filled the kettle, turned on the stove, and watched the flame catch. The silence pressed in. She tried to think of something practical, something to keep her mind from unraveling, but the house itself seemed to resist distraction. Every corner held a memory. The chair by the window where David used to drink his coffee and plan his day. The chipped mug that still bore the mark of his thumb. The calendar pinned above the sink, still stuck on the month before his diagnosis. When the kettle finally whistled, she didn't even hear it at first. She poured a cup and sat at the kitchen table. The bills lay there in a stack she had avoided for weeks. Electric, mortgage, insurance. Each envelope felt heavier than the last. She opened one at random and saw the red print at the top, final notice. Her hands began to tremble. She closed the letter, pressed it flat against the table, and stared at it until the ink blurred. The sound of the wind outside drew her gaze toward the window. Beyond the glass stretched the field, black and endless. The barn roof sagged under the weight of years. David had meant to fix it last summer, but the sickness had already begun its slow invasion. She remembered the day he came home from the doctor, his face pale but his eyes calm. He'd said, "It's not as bad as it sounds." But it was. It always was. By nightfall, the house had grown colder. She lit the fireplace in the living room and sank into his old armchair, pulling a blanket over her knees. The firelight flickered across the wooden floor, long, uneven planks that David had laid himself 30 years ago. Each one bore the marks of time, stains, scratches, little scars from years of living. She ran her gaze over them absently, then stopped. One of the boards near the hearth was slightly raised, its edge darkened as though it had been pried open before. For a moment she thought about getting up, checking it, but then she remembered his words again, spoken with that strange intensity. Never touch the living room floor. She frowned, unsettled. Why would he say that? He wasn't a secretive man. Everything he owned, everything he knew, he shared with her. The only thing he ever kept private were his ledgers, his farming accounts, but even those he'd shown her once or twice when explaining expenses. Could he have been hiding something? She shook the thought away. It was foolish. He'd been delirious, frightened. The sickness had taken more from him than strength. It had taken reason. The clock on the mantel struck 9. She stirred the fire and stared into the flames. The light threw dancing shadows across the ceiling. The house creaked with settling wood, and for a fleeting second she imagined she could hear him moving in the kitchen, humming under his breath like he used to. She closed her eyes and let the illusion linger until it faded. When she climbed into bed, sleep didn't come. She lay awake, listening to the wind rattle the shutters, to Eli's faint breathing down the hall. Every sound seemed amplified, the ticking of the clock, the groan of old beams, the whisper of something shifting beneath the floor. She told herself it was just the house settling, but the unease remained. Morning brought no relief. The sky was clear now, a pale winter blue, and sunlight streamed weakly through the curtains. Sarah rose early, her mind dull from exhaustion. She made breakfast, though neither of them ate much. Eli sat across the table, pushing his food around with his fork. "Mom," he said quietly, "what are we going to do now?" The question hung between them like smoke. What were they going to do? The farm was barely producing enough to pay for seed, let alone the mortgage. The insurance money would take months, maybe longer. David's death had not only left a void in her heart, but a crater in their lives. "We'll manage," she said, forcing a smile she didn't feel. "We always do." But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. Later that afternoon, she walked the perimeter of the property, checking the fence line. The air smelled of damp soil and wood smoke from distant chimneys. Her boots sank into the thawing ground, and with each step she felt the weight of everything David used to do. The tasks that had once seemed small but were now hers alone. Repairing fences, feeding the livestock, tending the machinery, all of it. She realized with a dull ache that she didn't even know how to start the old tractor. When she returned to the house, she paused at the porch and looked up at it as if seeing it for the first time. The paint was peeling, the shutters hung crooked, and the roof shingles were curling like brittle leaves. It wasn't just grief making the place feel heavy. It was the sheer burden of decay. The house was falling apart, and without David, so was she. That evening, after Eli went to bed, Sarah sat at the kitchen table again, the bills spread before her. She began making calculations on the back of an old envelope, writing and crossing out numbers until the page became a mess of ink. There was no solution. Every option led to the same end. Debt. Selling the farm would mean losing the last piece of David she had left. But if she didn't, they would lose it anyway. Her eyes wandered toward the living room doorway. From where she sat, she could see part of the floor, the faint glint of firelight reflecting off the wood. The thought came unbidden. Maybe she could do some of the repairs herself. The roof, the paint, the wiring. There were guides, videos, manuals. She'd seen other women manage it. Maybe if she could restore the house, she could buy time, maybe even sell a portion of the land. Her gaze lingered on the floorboards again. That one raised plank near the hearth caught the light in a way that made it look almost alive, breathing. She rose slowly and stepped closer. The wood groaned underfoot. Kneeling, she ran her hand along the grain. It was smooth, warm from the fire. Her fingers found the uneven edge of the lifted board. For a moment, curiosity tugged at her. But then David's voice returned, faint, distant, but still carrying the weight of command. "Promise me you'll never touch the living room floor." She drew back her hand, heart pounding. It was ridiculous, she thought. She'd buried him yesterday, and here she was, letting his dying words frighten her. But there was something in the memory of his face that day, something solemn and almost fearful, that made her hesitate. She straightened up and turned away. "Not tonight," she murmured. The house seemed to exhale as she walked back to the kitchen. That night she dreamed of him. In the dream he stood in the living room, the firelight flickering behind him, his hands covered in soil. He looked at her the way he always had when he was worried, but didn't want to show it. "It's not time yet," he said. And then she woke, the echo of his voice fading into the creak of the old floor beneath her bed. The following days passed in a blur of chores and exhaustion. Each morning she woke before dawn, tending to what animals remained, patching leaks, mending fences. Her hands blistered, her shoulders ached, but she kept going. It was the only thing that kept her from thinking too much. Yet every night, when the house grew quiet, her mind returned to that room, the floor, the promise, the mystery she didn't want but couldn't forget. On the 7th day after the funeral, she stood once more in the living room. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, highlighting the dust motes that danced in the air. The boards gleamed faintly in the light. Somewhere beneath them, she imagined, lay the heart of everything they had built together. 40 years of work, of love, of secrets. She didn't know why she felt that so strongly, but she did. She drew a long breath and whispered, "I'll take care of it, David." Somehow. Outside, the wind shifted, rustling through the bare trees like a sigh. The house groaned again, the floor beneath her feet answering with a quiet, almost human creak. It sounded like agreement or perhaps warning. Sarah couldn't tell which. She turned away, went to the kitchen, and began to plan what she would do next. The time for mourning was over. The time for survival had begun. By the time the snow began to melt along the edges of the fields, Sarah had stopped keeping track of the days. They all blended together, now gray mornings and restless nights, the rhythm of survival replacing the rhythm of life. The farmhouse creaked and groaned around her like an old ship in a storm, each sound reminding her that she was alone at the helm. David had been gone barely 2 weeks, but already his absence felt like a widening hollow, swallowing every corner of her days. She rose each morning before sunrise when the air still bit with cold and the sky outside was only beginning to blush with light. Her breath made clouds in the chill as she pulled on David's worn jacket, the one that still smelled faintly of sawdust and tobacco. In the barn, the animals greeted her with hungry bleats and low moans. She worked silently, pouring feed, hauling water, her hands growing raw and red. The tasks were endless, yet they gave her something she could grasp, something that didn't ache the way memories did. When she returned to the house, Eli was usually awake, sitting at the kitchen table with his cereal untouched, his eyes hollow. He had stopped asking when things would get better. Children learned quickly when adults didn't have answers. Sarah forced herself to smile each time she passed him, though the smile felt brittle, like glass about to crack. The repairs began out of necessity. The first leak appeared in the kitchen ceiling, dripping steadily into a saucepan she'd placed on the floor. The second came from a broken pipe in the bathroom that turned the tiles slick with water. Every creak, every draft reminded her how much David had done without complaint. He had always known how to fix things, how to make the impossible look simple. Now, standing with a wrench in one hand and a manual in the other, she realized just how vast the gap between them was. She started small, tightening bolts, sealing cracks, replacing a pane of glass in the window that had shattered last winter. Her hands shook at first, but with each small repair, her movements grew steadier. She wasn't strong, not in the way David had been, but she had something just as enduring, the stubborn refusal to quit. By evening, she would collapse onto the couch, her muscles sore and her palms covered with tiny cuts. It wasn't pride she felt, but something close to it, a faint spark that told her she could still keep the world from falling apart a little longer. It was during one of these long evenings that she first noticed the silence differently. The house wasn't just quiet, it was watchful. The way the floorboards seemed to sigh when she walked across them, the faint whisper of wind sneaking through the walls. Even the ticking of the clock, all of it felt like the house was breathing around her. alive in its grief. David had built much of it himself. She could almost hear his hammer in the beams, his laughter buried in the walls. He had poured his life into this place. Now it felt as though his spirit lingered in every inch of it. Eli followed her from room to room sometimes, pretending to help. He held the ladder, handed her nails, swept sawdust from the floor. But she could see the distance in his eyes, the kind of loss a child shouldn't have to carry. At night, she would hear him whispering to his father through the cracked door, telling him about school or the farm, as though David might still be listening. Sarah never stopped him. Let him believe it if it brought comfort. After a few weeks, she turned her attention to the living room. It was the heart of the house where David had spent his evenings reading the newspaper or falling asleep in his chair by the fire. The walls were faded from years of sun, the ceiling cracked like dry riverbeds. The carpet smelled faintly of smoke and earth, and beneath it lay the old floor, his floor. She pulled the rug back, exposing the planks that stretched from wall to wall, darkened by time and soot. For a moment she simply stood there, staring. The boards were uneven, their edges curling slightly. She knelt and ran her hand over the wood, feeling the grooves beneath her fingertips. It was rough, but solid. David had built it when they were newly married, using lumber he'd salvaged after a storm had torn through the neighboring county. She remembered how proud he had been, how he'd made her promise never to let anyone replace it. Later, that promise had changed. "Never touch the living room floor," he had said with a strange urgency. It had haunted her ever since. She sat back on her heels, brushing the dust from her palms. Maybe he'd been trying to protect her. From what, she didn't know. The thought that he might have hidden something there flickered in her mind but quickly dimmed. David wasn't that kind of man. He'd never kept secrets from her. Except perhaps one. That night, after Eli had gone to bed, Sarah sat alone in the living room with a cup of tea. The fire cast long, quivering shadows across the walls. The wood beneath her creaked occasionally, as though shifting in its sleep. The more she stared at it, the more it seemed to call to her, whispering with every pop and sigh of the fire. She told herself it was just her imagination, that grief made her see ghosts in ordinary things. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was alive beneath those planks. The days blurred into one another. Snow gave way to cold rain, and the air filled with the smell of thawing soil. Sarah continued her repairs, moving from one room to the next, fixing, patching, repainting. Her arms grew stronger, her hands calloused. The work became her shield against despair. The harder she pushed herself, the less she had to think. But no matter how many rooms she mended, the living room waited. Every time she passed through it, her eyes were drawn to that one uneven board near the hearth. She began avoiding stepping on it, though she couldn't explain why. Sometimes at night, she thought she heard movement under the floor, a soft rustling, like wind trapped in the walls. Once she even got down on her knees and pressed her ear to the wood. The sound stopped immediately, leaving her with only the pounding of her own heart. When she told herself it must be mice, she almost believed it. The financial strain worsened. Letters came from the bank with cruel regularity, each stamped with urgent red ink. Outstanding balance, final warning, foreclosure pending. She hid them in the drawer under the phone so Eli wouldn't see. The weight of them grew heavier by the week. She began skipping meals to stretch what little money they had left. Nights became colder, darker. The fire burned low because she rationed wood, saving every scrap for later. It was during one of these nights that she sat by the dimming fire and thought about what David would have done. He had always found a way out, always managed to fix things before they broke beyond repair. But what had he expected her to do without him? Her eyes drifted again to the floor, to that stubborn board that refused to sit flat. "Why did you tell me not to touch it?" she whispered. The question hung in the air, unanswered. She tried to distract herself by writing a list of chores. The roof needed patching, the fence along the west field had fallen again, and the kitchen ceiling sagged dangerously. But her mind kept circling back to the living room. She could almost feel the weight of David's last request pressing down on her, turning a simple piece of wood into something sacred, untouchable. The following morning brought a brief visit from a neighbor, old Mrs. Dunley, who lived 2 miles down the road. She brought a casserole and a clumsy sort of pity. You holding up, dear? She asked as Sarah stood on the porch, trying to hide the exhaustion on her face. If you need help with the farm, you just let me know. Sarah thanked her and smiled, but when the woman's truck disappeared down the road, she set the casserole on the counter untouched. The loneliness in the house seemed even louder after that. Eli spent most afternoons outside, exploring the edges of the property or sitting under the maple tree near his father's grave. Sometimes she watched from the window, her heart aching. He didn't cry, but his silence said everything. She wanted to tell him that things would be all right, but she couldn't bring herself to lie. That evening, while fixing a broken hinge on the pantry door, Sarah noticed the hammer she was using was one of David's old ones, his initials carved faintly into the handle. She traced them with her thumb and felt an ache rise in her throat. The handle was smooth from years of use, the metal head dulled by time. It struck her that everything in this house bore his mark, his effort, his patience. The floor, especially, was the one thing he had touched more than any other. When she walked into the living room again, it felt different, like standing inside a memory. The air smelled faintly of ash and pine resin. The fire crackled weakly, casting orange light across the boards. She stood over the raised plank, her shadow falling across it, and felt a strange pull in her chest. She thought of the promise she had made without thinking, and of how absurd it seemed now. Why should she honor the words of a dying man who had left her nothing but debt and an old house falling to pieces? Yet the idea of defying him felt impossible. Love, she realized, didn't end cleanly with death. It tangled itself into every choice, every hesitation. Even anger couldn't untie it completely. Later that night, she dreamed of the floor again. In the dream, she was standing barefoot in the living room. The boards beneath her were warm, glowing faintly like embers. She could hear something humming beneath them, steady and low, like a heartbeat. Then a voice. His voice spoke her name, and she woke with a gasp. She lay there for a long time, listening to the rain beating against the windows, her heart hammering in her chest. She wanted to believe it was just her mind playing tricks, grief twisting her thoughts into strange shapes. But the feeling that something was waiting, something just beneath the surface, would not leave her. When morning came, she made up her mind. The time for mourning was over. She would fix what needed fixing. The roof, the walls, the floors, even that floor if she had to. She owed it to David, to Eli, and maybe even to herself. She didn't know yet what she would find, but she was done being afraid of the house. As she gathered her tools that day, the hammer, the crowbar, the box of nails, she noticed how the light fell through the kitchen window, cutting across the room and into the living room beyond. Dust drifted through it like tiny golden motes. The air smelled of earth and old wood. Somewhere deep in her, a quiet certainty stirred. The next step she took would change everything. She looked toward the living room one last time before stepping inside. The floor waited in silence, still and ancient, like a secret keeping its breath. The morning came shrouded in gray. A thin mist hung over the fields, and the air inside the farmhouse felt colder than usual, as if the house itself knew what was about to happen. Sarah woke before dawn, unable to shake the heaviness pressing on her chest. She moved quietly so as not to wake Eli, her steps echoing faintly on the creaking boards. The kitchen smelled faintly of dust and cold coffee. She lit the stove, but the flame flickered weakly, dying twice before catching. It was a bad omen, she thought, though she didn't believe in such things. On the table lay the newest envelope from the bank, its edges damp from where she had gripped it too tightly the night before. She didn't need to open it to know what it said. The last notice had given her 30 days to make a payment. There was no money to be found, not in the accounts, not in the barn, not anywhere. Selling the land would bring barely enough to cover the debt, and the thought of parting with the soil David had spent his life tending filled her with dread. It wasn't just earth, it was him, everything he'd built and believed in. She ran her fingers across the table, rough with age, and whispered, "I'm doing my best." The sound of Eli's footsteps broke the silence. He appeared in the doorway, hair tousled, eyes still puffy with sleep. "Morning," he said softly. His voice had grown thinner these past weeks, as if grief had hollowed it out. "Morning," she answered, trying to sound steady. She poured him the last of the milk, thin and nearly sour, and watched him eat in silence. The boy stared out the window at the fields. "It looks smaller," he said suddenly. "The farm, like it's shrinking." Sarah looked out too. The fog clung to the edges of the land, swallowing the fences and trees. "It just feels that way," she said, though she wasn't sure she believed it. When he left for school, she stood in the doorway, watching him walk down the dirt road till he disappeared behind the curve. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and old leaves. For a long time she didn't move. The world felt frozen, waiting. Then, almost without thinking, she turned toward the living room. The light was pale through the windows, throwing long streaks across the floor. Dust floated in the air, golden and fragile. She stood at the threshold, the weight of her husband's words pressing against her chest. "Never touch the living room floor." She whispered them aloud as though saying them might help her understand them. Never touch it. But why? What could possibly lie beneath a floor that was so dangerous or so sacred? Every logical part of her mind told her it was absurd, that there was no reason to fear a few planks of old wood. But another part, deeper and quieter, hesitated. That was the part that still heard his voice in the creak of the house at night. Her gaze fell on the small raised plank near the hearth. The uneven edge had bothered her for weeks. She had stepped over it so many times that the movement had become automatic, but today it seemed to call to her. She crouched, running her hand along the grain. The wood was cold under her palm. She pressed down gently and it gave slightly, just enough to make a faint sound, a soft click of loosened nails. The sound startled her heart into a faster rhythm. She straightened quickly and backed away, breathing hard. "Not yet," she murmured, but the words felt hollow. She turned and walked into the kitchen, but her mind wouldn't let go of it. Every sound in the house, every shifting shadow seemed to draw her back. When she tried to wash dishes, she caught herself glancing toward the doorway. When she fed the animals, her thoughts returned to the floor. By noon, her resolve had begun to crumble. The decision came not as a moment of courage, but of exhaustion. She had spent the morning going through the shed, searching for anything she could sell: old tools, spare parts, even David's collection of wrenches. But every item carried some memory, and she found herself unable to let them go. When she came back inside, her eyes fell again on the bank envelope. It sat on the counter, pale and menacing, a reminder that time was running out. She looked around the house, the peeling paint, the cracked plaster, the worn furniture, and realized there was nothing left to lose. That evening, after Eli went to bed, Sarah stood once more in the living room. The lamps were off, and only the fire cast its dim glow across the walls. The room was quiet except for the occasional snap of wood in the hearth. She could hear the faint wind outside brushing against the windows. She crossed to the corner where David's old toolbox sat, the metal cold under her fingers. She opened it and found his crowbar lying among the other tools, its handle smooth from years of use. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. The weight felt foreign, almost sacred. She stared at it for a long time before kneeling beside the uneven plank. The firelight danced across the wood, flickering like breath. "I'm sorry, David," she whispered, "but I have to." The crowbar slid under the edge of the board with a soft groan. She hesitated, the cold metal biting into her palm. Then she pressed down. The wood resisted at first, creaking and splintering, then gave way with a loud crack that echoed through the room. She froze, listening. Nothing moved. Only the faint hiss of the fire filled the silence. She pried the board up completely and laid it aside. Beneath it, a small hollow space yawned in the dirt. It was deeper than she expected, about a foot down. The beam of her flashlight cut through the dust, and something glinted faintly. Her heart skipped. She reached for another board, pried it loose, then another. The hole grew wider, the dust rising in a fine mist around her. The smell of old earth filled her lungs. And then she saw it. A corner of metal, dull and red with rust. Her breath caught in her throat. She brushed away the dirt with her sleeve, revealing more of it, a box perhaps, or a chest. Her hands shook as she cleared the rest of the soil away. It was heavy, solid, the kind of metal made to last. A small lock, eaten through with corrosion, hung from the front. For a moment she just stared at it, unable to move. The air felt thick and still, as though the house itself were holding its breath. "What did you do, David?" she whispered. Her voice sounded too loud in the small room. She fetched the hammer from the toolbox and struck the lock. The brittle metal snapped easily. Slowly she lifted the lid. The hinges creaked in protest and a rush of stale air escaped, carrying the scent of iron and dust. Inside, wrapped in an old cloth, lay several small bundles tied with twine. Her fingers trembled as she unwrapped the first one. Inside were paper bills, hundreds of them, faded and brittle but unmistakably real. Her hands flew to her mouth. "Oh my God," she breathed. There were more bundles, each the same. Beneath them lay a few old notebooks, their covers worn thin. She lifted one and flipped through it. The pages were filled with David's handwriting, neat columns of numbers, dates, notes in the margins. It was his ledger, she realized, but not the one she had seen before. This one recorded transactions she had never known about: money moved, payments made, small sums saved and hidden. He had been planning something. Her eyes caught a small envelope at the bottom of the chest. Her name was written on it in his handwriting. Sarah. For a long moment she couldn't move. Her hands hovered over it, afraid to touch, afraid to know. Then with a deep breath, she slid her finger under the flap and opened it. Inside was a folded letter, the paper yellowed with age. She unfolded it slowly, her heart pounding. The first line blurred as tears filled her eyes. "If you are reading this, it means I am gone." She sank to her knees, the letter trembling in her hands. She forced herself to read on. He wrote about the farm, about the years they had struggled, about how he had begun saving small amounts of money when he realized how fragile their security really was. He didn't trust the banks, he said. He remembered his father losing everything during the recession, the humiliation that had followed. He had sworn never to let that happen again. So he had hidden the money here, where no one could touch it, where it would wait until the time was right. He wrote that he had meant to tell her, but then the sickness came. "I wanted to make sure you and Eli would be safe," he wrote. "If I told you too soon, you might have tried to use it before it was needed. I wanted to protect you from the world, and maybe from yourself. I'm sorry for the burden I've left you with. I know you'll understand one day." Sarah's vision blurred. Her tears fell onto the page, smudging the ink. She pressed the letter to her chest and rocked slowly, the ache in her heart too deep for sound. For weeks she had cursed him in her thoughts for leaving her unprepared, for burdening her with a life that felt impossible. And all the while he had been thinking of her, planning for her, even in his final days. When she could finally breathe again, she looked back into the chest. The money, the ledgers, the letter, it was all real. She lifted one of the bundles of cash, felt the weight of it. It wasn't fortune, not enough to make them rich, but it was salvation, enough to pay the bank, to repair the house, to start again. She imagined what David must have felt when he buried it: hope, fear, love. Every board she had pried up had been a piece of his final act of care. The fire had burned low, its light dimming. She replaced the boards gently, sealing the chest once more. Tomorrow she would tell Eli, but not tonight. Tonight she wanted to sit in the quiet, with David's letter in her hands and the faint sound of the wind moving through the chimney. The floor beneath her felt different now, no longer a barrier but a bridge. As she leaned back against the hearth, exhaustion overtook her. Her eyelids grew heavy and she dozed off, the letter still clutched to her chest. In her sleep, she dreamed of him again. He stood by the fire just as she remembered, his eyes soft, his hands clean of the soil that had once stained them. "You found it," he said. "Good. Now take care of our home." She woke just before dawn, the embers glowing faintly. The house was silent. For the first time since his death, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt peaceful. She rose stiffly, folded the letter, and placed it on the mantel. The first light of morning touched the floor, illuminating the faint seams between the boards she had pried open. They no longer looked threatening or mysterious. They looked like what they had always been, part of a home built with love, sacrifice, and secrets meant only to protect. Outside, the fog was lifting. She stepped onto the porch, breathing in the sharp morning air. The fields stretched before her, vast and waiting. The house behind her stood tall, no longer haunted, but watching, alive once more. The promise had been broken, but in its breaking, Something deeper had been kept. The morning after the discovery felt different, as if the air itself had changed. The sunlight filtering through the windows was warmer, softer, as though the house had exhaled after holding its breath for too long. Sarah woke on the couch, still clutching the folded letter against her chest, her body sore from sleeping on the floorboards she had just uncovered the night before. For a moment she wasn't sure if it had all been a dream, the chest, the money, the words written in David's familiar hand. But when she looked toward the hearth, she saw the small patch of lighter wood where she had pried the planks loose. The crowbar and hammer still lay beside it, a quiet testament that what had happened was real. She rose slowly, feeling the weight of both exhaustion and disbelief. The living room seemed to have changed overnight. The same furniture, the same worn curtains, the same old rug folded over the edge of the fireplace, but now the space felt alive again, filled with something she hadn't felt in months. Not just relief. It was as if the walls themselves carried his presence more tangibly now, as though he had returned, not in body, but in spirit, through the words he had left behind. Eli's footsteps sounded faintly in the hallway. He appeared in the doorway, his hair sticking up, eyes squinting in the morning light. "Mom, you didn't come to bed." She looked at him, unsure how to begin explaining what she had found. "I know," she said softly. "There was something I needed to take care of." He yawned, then frowned when he noticed the tools on the floor. "Did you fix something?" Sarah hesitated, then nodded. "Yes," she said. "I think I did." She didn't tell him more, not yet. She wanted to hold this quiet miracle to herself a little longer, to let the reality of it settle before she shared it. After he left for school, she returned to the table where she had placed David's letter. The paper was fragile, yellowed at the edges, the ink slightly smudged from where her tears had fallen. She unfolded it carefully, her fingers tracing the familiar shape of his handwriting. The strong, deliberate strokes that had once signed checks, written love notes on scraps of paper, marked dates on the family calendar. Each curve of the letters seemed to carry his voice. Reading it again, she felt as if he were speaking directly to her, sitting across from her in the dim light of morning. "If you are reading this, it means I am gone." The words were simple, but they struck her like a blow. There was no hesitation, no wasted sentiment, just the quiet certainty of a man who had spent his life preparing for the worst and hoping for the best. He explained everything in his straightforward way, the secret savings, the distrust of banks, the memories of his father's ruin. He wrote about his fears, how helpless he had felt as his body failed him, knowing he would have to leave her to face the world alone. He confessed that he had wanted to tell her, had nearly done so many times, but he couldn't bear the thought of seeing fear in her eyes before he left. "You've always been stronger than you think," he wrote, "but even strong people need a little help when the storm comes." Sarah read the letter again and again until the words blurred together. Each line was a window into his thoughts during those final months. There were small details she recognized, references to the last harvest, notes about the equipment that needed repair, even a reminder to check the west fence before spring. But between those practical instructions lay the heart of what he wanted her to know. That every nail he'd driven into this house, every dollar he'd hidden, every word he'd left was for her and their son. She pressed the paper to her lips, feeling tears rise again. For weeks she had cursed him for leaving her unprepared, for dying with secrets. Now she understood that his silence hadn't been abandonment. It had been love. A love so careful it had tried to shield her even from worry. She realized that every time he had looked at her during those last days, when his voice was too weak to speak, he had been holding the secret, waiting for the moment he could no longer keep it. When she finally folded the letter again, she felt a calm she hadn't known in months. The fear that had gnawed at her every day since the funeral was still there, but muted now, transformed into something else, purpose. The discovery had changed nothing and everything at once. The debts were still real, the house still old, the work still waiting, but she was no longer powerless. David had given her the one thing she had lost completely, a chance. That afternoon, she took the bundles of money and spread them carefully across the kitchen table. The bills were old, some brittle, some faded, all tied with bits of frayed string. She counted them slowly, hands shaking as the total grew larger and larger. By the time she finished, her eyes were wide with disbelief. It wasn't just enough to pay the bank, it was enough to rebuild. The sum represented not wealth, but security proof that David's foresight had been more than just caution. He had saved their future in silence. She found herself laughing softly, a sound strange and unfamiliar in her own house. The echo of it startled her, and for the first time in months, it didn't hurt. She gathered the money back into its bundles and returned it to the chest for safekeeping. She left the letter out, though, resting it on the mantel above the fireplace, where she could see it whenever she passed by. It felt right that it should remain there, a quiet guardian watching over them. That evening, she sat Eli down after dinner. The boy looked tired from school, his shoulders slumped, his appetite gone as usual. She hesitated for a moment, unsure how to tell him something that would change everything. "There's something I need to show you," she said finally. His eyes widened in concern. "What is it?" She led him into the living room and knelt by the hearth. "Do you remember how your father used to say never to touch the floor here?" He nodded slowly. "I remember. You always said it was just one of his strange rules." She smiled faintly. "I thought so too, but it turns out your father had a reason. He was trying to protect something." She pried open the same boards and the faint smell of earth rose again. Eli crouched beside her, eyes wide with curiosity as she revealed the metal chest. When she lifted the lid and he saw what was inside, his mouth fell open. "Is that money?" he asked in a whisper. "It's what your father saved," she said, her voice trembling. "All these years he was putting aside what little he could. He hid it here, under our feet. He wanted it to be there for us when we needed it most." She took out the letter and handed it to him carefully. "He wrote this for us." Eli read silently for several minutes, his small hands shaking as he held the fragile paper. When he finished, he looked up, and for the first time in weeks she saw tears in his eyes. "He was thinking about us," he said, "all that time." Sarah nodded. "He always was." They sat together for a long while after that, neither speaking. The only sound was the faint ticking of the old clock and the gentle crackle of the fire. It was as if David were there with them, sitting in his chair, watching them finally uncover the gift he had left behind. Over the next few days, Sarah began to make plans. She contacted the bank, settled the debt, and felt a weight lift from her shoulders as she signed the papers, confirming that the farm was safe. The manager, a man who had looked at her with quiet pity for months, stared at her in surprise when she handed him the payment. "You've managed to come through after all," he said. "I didn't think there was a way." She smiled faintly. "There always is, if you look hard enough." Back at the farmhouse, she threw herself into the work of restoration. The roof needed fixing, the plumbing replacing, the barn strengthening before spring planting. She hired a few local men to help, using some of the money David had left, and together they began repairing what years of neglect had damaged. The days were long, filled with dust and noise, but for the first time in a long while, Sarah welcomed it. The hammering, the scraping, the smell of fresh lumber, it all reminded her of him. Every nail driven into the walls felt like another heartbeat returned to the house. At night, she would sit in the living room, staring at the floor. The boards she had pried up had been carefully re-nailed into place, though she could still see the faint seams where they had once been lifted. She often ran her foot across that spot absent-mindedly, as if the motion kept her connected to the secret that had changed everything. The letter remained on the mantel, framed now in glass. Each time she passed by, her eyes caught the first line, and she felt the same warmth spread through her chest. She began to notice little things she hadn't before. The way the light moved across the floor at sunset, the faint hum of the wind through the rafters, the smell of sawdust and smoke mingling together. The house no longer seemed haunted by absence. It was inhabited by memory. One night after a long day of repairs, Eli asked her a question that stopped her mid-step. "Mom," he said, "why do you think Dad made you wait to find it? Why not tell you before?" She thought for a long moment before answering. "Because he knew I wouldn't have been ready," she said. "He knew that sometimes we don't understand the weight of something until we have to carry it alone." She smiled faintly. "And maybe he knew I'd keep my promise, that I'd wait, even if I didn't understand why." Eli nodded, though his eyes still carried the puzzled look of a child trying to comprehend the choices of adults. "He must have loved you a lot," he said quietly. "He did," she replied, "more than I ever realized." As winter gave way to spring, the fields began to green again. The first shoots of wheat pushed through the thawing soil, and the air filled with the smell of life returning. The farmhouse, once cold and shadowed, began to brighten with each passing day. The laughter of mother and son returned to the rooms where silence had once ruled. The floorboards still creaked under their feet, but now the sound no longer carried sorrow. It was a melody of endurance, a rhythm that tied past and present together. On the first truly warm evening of spring, Sarah sat by the window, the letter in her lap, watching the sun set behind the barn. The horizon glowed orange and gold, the same colors that had filled her wedding day all those years ago. She thought of David, of the life they had built together, of the love that had survived even death. He had not only left her money, he had left her faith. Faith in herself, in the future, in the quiet strength that comes from enduring loss and finding hope again. The house felt lighter now. The promise had been kept, the secret revealed, the burden shared. The living room floor that had once symbolized mystery and fear had become a symbol of something else entirely, a legacy of love, foresight, and devotion, carved not in stone, but in wood and memory. That night, as the stars emerged over the fields, Sarah whispered a final thank you to the man who had built not only a home, but a life that could endure beyond him. And when she closed her eyes, the sound of the wind through the trees seemed to carry his voice again, soft and steady, the same words he had once spoken by the fire. "You'll be all right, Sarah. You always were." Spring arrived like a sigh of relief across the Harper farm. The ground, once frozen and hard, softened beneath the sun's slow warmth. Patches of green began to appear across the fields, shy at first, then bolder, painting life back into the soil that had slept all winter. The air smelled of rain and rebirth, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the house no longer carried the scent of grief. It smelled of work-fresh paint, sawdust, and soap, the scent of things mended, reclaimed. Sarah woke earlier now, not out of dread but habit. The routine that had once felt like punishment had become rhythm again. There was order in the sound of hammers from the workers she had hired, in the steady churn of the tractor, in the laughter that sometimes rose from the barn where Eli helped with small chores. The boy's face had changed since the day they found the letter. The sharpness of sadness had softened into quiet determination. He no longer walked with his shoulders bowed. When he spoke of his father now, his voice carried warmth instead of pain. The repairs moved quickly. The roof that had leaked all winter gleamed with new shingles. The walls had been sanded, repainted, and sealed against the wind. Even the old porch steps that had sagged for years were finally replaced. Sarah moved among the workers, sleeves rolled up, paint on her arms, unafraid to take part in the labor. Every nail driven into the frame, every board fitted into place felt like a conversation with David, an answer to the unspoken promise that she would take care of what he left behind. But the living room was hers alone. No hired hands, no help. She refused to let anyone touch that space. It was where she had found him again, where the heart of their story had been buried and unearthed. When the time came to repair the floor, she sent everyone home early and stood alone in the room, the evening sun filtering through the windows in golden stripes. The boards glowed softly in the light, each scar and groove telling its own small story. Years of footsteps, laughter, Christmas trees, arguments, reconciliations. She could trace the pattern of their life in the wood grain. She had already bought new boards, oak this time, strong and warm in color. She planned to replace most of the old floor, but not all. One section, the spot where she had pried open the planks and found the chest she would leave untouched. That she knew had to remain as it was. Some things weren't meant to be erased. She laid out her tools carefully, then knelt beside the old boards, pressing her palm flat against them, as if greeting an old friend. "We did it," she whispered. The room answered in silence, but she felt the words settle in her chest like peace. The work took days. She pulled up the old wood one piece at a time, stacked it by the wall, sanded the subfloor, and began to fit the new planks in their place. The smell of fresh oak filled the room. Each evening when she stopped, she would light the fire and sit in the armchair, the same one David had used, staring at the progress she'd made. She thought often about what he would have said, how he might have teased her for using finer wood than he ever would have bought, how he would have insisted on measuring every cut twice. She smiled at the thought, sometimes even laughing aloud, catching herself before tears could follow. When the last of the boards was nailed down, she stood in the doorway, the hammer still in her hand. The room looked different now, brighter, more open, but it hadn't lost its soul. The one old plank she had kept in place ran like a quiet scar across the center of the floor, a line of memory in the midst of renewal. She liked it that way. Life, she thought, wasn't meant to be perfect. It was meant to hold its marks. Eli wandered in as she was sweeping away the last of the sawdust. "It looks new," he said, eyes wide. "It smells like the hardware store." Sarah laughed. "It's oak, stronger than the old boards. It should last longer than both of us." He knelt, running his hand along the grain. "Did you keep the piece?" he asked, glancing toward the section near the fireplace. "The one where you found Dad's box?" She nodded. "I did. Some things are meant to stay." He smiled, and for a moment she could see David in the angle of that smile, in the way his eyes softened. "Dad would have liked this," he said quietly. "He would have said you did it right." They stood together for a while, watching the firelight reflect on the new boards. The warmth spread through the room, touching the walls, the pictures, the ceiling everywhere. The sound of the crackling fire and the faint creaks of the new floor made a melody that felt familiar. It was the sound of a home alive again. As the weeks passed, life settled into a new pattern. The farm began to thrive once more. The fields yielded better than they had in years. The tractors ran smoothly, and the small vegetable garden beside the porch bloomed with color. Sarah and Eli worked side by side, and though they were often tired, there was satisfaction in every ache and blister. The money that David had left was handled carefully. She used some of it to modernize the farm equipment, some to pay off debts, and kept the rest for emergencies. She understood now why he had hidden it, not out of secrecy, but out of love. He had wanted to make sure they would be safe long after he was gone, to leave her not only with means, but with choice. In the evenings when the work was done, Sarah would sit by the fire again, often with a cup of tea and the framed letter resting on her lap. She had read it so many times that she nearly knew it by heart, yet it never lost its meaning. Sometimes she would read it aloud to Eli, her voice steady and calm, and together they would talk about David. Not as a loss, but as a part of them still here. "He never really left," Eli said one night, looking at the photograph on the mantel. "He's in everything. The farm, the house, even this floor." She smiled. "Especially this floor." The spring deepened into early summer. The days grew longer, filled with the hum of insects and the distant rustle of crops swaying in the wind. The house, once so cold and shadowed, now breathed with warmth and laughter. Friends began visiting again, neighbors who had once kept their distance, unsure how to approach grief. They came bearing casseroles, tools, stories. The Harper farm, which had seemed doomed to fade away, was alive with noise and life again. One evening, as the sun set over the fields, Sarah decided to do something she had put off for months. She took a small box from the drawer of the sideboard. Inside were the old photographs she and David had taken over the years, pictures from their wedding day, from the early years of the farm, from Eli's first birthday. Some were worn at the edges, faded from the sun, but each one told a piece of their story. She spread them out across the coffee table, smiling as she looked through them. When Eli joined her, they spent hours remembering. They laughed at David's mustache in the 80s, at the way he always wore that same battered hat no matter the season. And when the laughter faded, they sat in silence, both of them comforted by the memories rather than broken by them. Later, after Eli went to bed, Sarah stayed by the fire. She thought about how much had changed and how much hadn't. The grief was still there, quiet but present, like a scar that would always be part of her. But alongside it lived gratitude, deeper than she had ever known. She looked down at the floor, tracing the line of the old plank with her toe. The promise she had once broken now felt less like a sin and more like a blessing, a passage to understanding, to closure. David's secret hadn't just saved their home, it had saved her from losing herself. The night outside was soft and full of sound. Crickets sang, frogs croaked near the pond, and somewhere in the distance an owl hooted. Through the open window came the scent of cut grass and rain-soaked earth. The house glowed warmly behind her, each room softly lit. For the first time since David's death, she felt truly at peace. When she finally rose to go to bed, she paused by the mantel, where the framed letter and David's photograph stood side by side. The flickering light from the fire danced across the glass, making it seem as though he might wink at her from within the picture. She touched the frame lightly. "You kept your promise," she whispered, "and I kept mine." The next morning, the sun rose over the fields in a blaze of gold. Sarah stood on the porch, coffee cup in hand, watching the light spill over the land. Eli ran past her toward the barn, laughter echoing through the crisp air. The tractor coughed to life, the chickens clucked in their coop, and the wind carried the scent of new wheat. Behind her, through the open door, she could see the living room floor gleaming in the morning sun, the old plank blending perfectly with the new. It would always be there, that single reminder of where they had been and how far they had come. She knew that someday Eli would inherit this place, and maybe he'd tell his own children about the floor his grandfather had built and the secret that had slept beneath it. Maybe he'd teach them what she had learned, the value of patience, of love that plans quietly, of promises kept even through years of silence. As she stepped inside, her boots clicking softly against the polished wood, she realized that the house no longer echoed. It sang. Every creak, every sound of shifting beams was alive, full of warmth and memory. She knelt for a moment, pressing her hand against the old plank one last time. "Thank you," she whispered. The floor was cool under her palm, but steady, strong. The farmhouse no longer felt like a tomb for the past, but a vessel for the future. It carried within it the story of loss and love, of faith rediscovered, of one man's foresight and one woman's resilience. And as the wind moved through the fields outside, bending the wheat like waves on an unseen sea, Sarah felt the deep, unshakable certainty that they would be all right. She smiled to herself, turned toward the door, and let the light pour in. If this story moved you, don't leave just yet. Hit subscribe and turn on the bell so you never miss what comes next. Check out our other incredible stories waiting for you right now. And share this video with someone who still believes that love and hope never die.